I hope everyone is well and safe today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I did want to let you know that this is going to be recorded, so we can share it with folks who we didn't invite or who weren't able to log in at this time. We'll leave time for questions at the end, so you can use the Q&A box. If some of you have been logging into Zoom meetings, you usually use the chat. There's in your toolbar, there's a box labeled Q&A. And I'd like to introduce Grace Harmon, who has joined us today on this call. She's our communications manager. She's going to be manning the chat box and the question and answer box. If you have technical difficulties, you have questions that you want to ask, she'll be managing all that. Grace, did you want to pop in and say hi? Grace is not going to pop in and say hi, but that's okay. Let's jump in. So today I wanted to talk to you about two individuals, those that I have dubbed, for lack of a better term, half-freed slaves. These two gentlemen, by the names of Anthony Portuguese and Manuel Trumpeter, lived in New Amsterdam in the mid-1600s. They farmed land that actually would become Washington Square Park about 200 years after they lived. So, why do I find this topic so compelling? What can it tell us? One, what's the importance of what it was like in New Amsterdam, in what would become New York City so long ago, during the Dutch colony? What was it like to live here, and what was it like to live here for a particular group of people? The second, understanding what the landscape of Washington Square Park used to be. So what were its geographic features? What was its location relative to the colony proper? And how it came to play such a large role, why this place becomes a park. And three, what I think is really interesting is documentation or sources, the things that are available for us to kind of get to know people, and to get to know people who you wouldn't expect to find in the historical record. So who are Anthony Portuguese and Manuel Trumpeter? When New York was first settled as New Amsterdam, 1825, 1826, it's settled by the Dutch West India Company. It's not settled by a country, it's settled by a company. And Black slaves actually play a large role in the life of what is to eventually become the colony, but also in the company. And the company owned about 70 slaves. And I think when you start looking at these two folks, Manuel and Anthony, you see that slavery, at least for these company slaves, looked a lot different than what we think of as slavery in New York, say, hundreds of years later. And we know about what life looked like for these folks thanks to records from the colony, the city, and the church. And a lot of these records can be found at the New York State Library. And what you're seeing on your screen right now is an article written thanks to scholar Peter Christoph from records that he found at the New York State Library. And I really love this article because it really dives down and gives us a sense of what it was like to be a slave at this time. You can see our first, I have a blue circle or a blue oval. You see Anthony Portuguese, one of the folks who becomes a landowner at Washington Square. You can see him in the record. He is suing a white merchant. His hog suffered damage when this other gentleman's dog bit it. So, you know, this is really different than what we think of as slavery in America, slavery in New York. One, he's owning property. Mr. Portuguese owns property. And two, he has redress in court. And this article goes on to explain other instances of how it was a lot different than what we think of as slavery. One, they can get married, inherit property. They can even be paid for work outside of their time of the company. And they can be baptized in the church. And at one point, particularly during a time of disturbance with the native population, slaves were even given weapons. So we often think of slavery as being something where the ruling class was very scared of giving their slaves any agency. In this case, they came together as a group in what was kind of a little bit of hostile country. So much different than what we think of as slavery in New York and then later in the South. Documents show us when folks started moving from slavery to freedom in New Amsterdam. Willem Kieft, who was the 5th director of New Netherland and also a director in the West India Company, began granting slaves freedom, or what I call half freedom, in the early to mid 1640s. And along with freedom, the slaves are given plots of land. And the plots of land are large enough that they can actually feed themselves and their family. And let me just bring us to the next slide. Maybe. Whoop. Sorry, guys. Okay. Thanks to Phelps Stokes and his I hate saying this word, iconography of Manhattan Island, we actually do have some access to maps. So let's look at our first. Manuel Trumpeter is given his freedom and a land grant in 1643. And first, just because it's a little hard to read, I've put a green square around what is now Washington Square Park. And then when we go to the next slide, you can see Manuel Trumpeter's, is outlined in blue. And forgive my drawing skills. It's not exactly the the shape of his plot, but you can see that it's rather large. And the northwest portion of it winds up in what is now the northeast corner of Washington Square Park, or what is now Washington Square Park. And then Anthony Portuguese is given his freedom and a land grant in 1645. And and that's just a little bit clearer. That's Trumpeter's land. Okay, so that is, now we move and you can see again, the green square is Washington Square Park approximately, and the blue is Anthony Portuguese's land. Okay, why half free? Joan Geismar, who is the archaeologist who was hired to do the archaeology for the park during its most recent renovation, she uses the term in her reports about the park and where we should look for significant archaeological findings. She uses the term indentured servant for this group of what I call half-freed slaves. I don't like indentured servant because we tend to think of, the Irish period of time where indentured servants had a certain period of time where they were required to work for the person who paid their way over to the new land. And then after that, they were completely free. Trumpeter and Portuguese, for them and the other former slaves granted freedom, they had some requirements that I think kind of pushes on this idea of being totally free. So they were required to give a number of crops and animals back to the colony each year. They could also be called into service to the West India Company at any time that there was need. Now, they would be paid for it, but they were still required to do it. And I think particularly their children and their spouses were not automatically free because they were. They were allowed to purchase the freedom eventually of their loved ones if they could raise the money, but it wasn't automatic. And so that's why I use the term half free. I would like to add while we're talking about this that Peter Stuyvesant, who was the last director of New Netherland, before the English came and took over in 1664, he actually freed all the remaining company slaves by that point with very little stipulations. I think one woman had to come and clean for him. But, you know, that being the biggest stipulation, that didn't seem so bad. So the last kind of question that I think is important to look at is why was this, were the Dutch particularly generous, or were they particularly, connected to their slaves, or they were looking at it from a humanistic point of view? I don't think we know enough to assign motives. So Christoph, the scholar who wrote the article we looked at the beginning, he reminds us, and I quote, "The surviving documents give us little to work with in determining the motives of the corporate mind." And he wants to remind us that we're looking at a very particular period of time and a very particular geographic region. So we can't say that the Dutch were necessarily more benevolent in what their slave trade and slave holding looked like compared to other countries and other societies. But I would like to kind of explore what some of these motives could be. I think certainly the land grants show us the need for somebody to be producing food. So the fact that they needed to give a certain amount of crops and livestock to the company, the New Amsterdam was really founded as a company town, and fur trade was the main business. So there weren't a lot of people actually coming to be farmers. And so this ensured that there was food for the folks who lived here. It could have also been a way to do business well. We think about some of the perks that you might get as an employee at a company nowadays. It could be somewhat of that, keeping your workers, your laborers, in this case, ones you own, happy could have been the best way of doing business. And I'd also like to propose something a little bit different, and that is safety. So I want to take a look at what's called the Ratzer map. It was created in 1767 by a gentleman named Bernard Ratzer. That's how it gets its name, leading up to the Revolutionary War. So this is from 1767, a good 100 years after the time that we're looking at. But I think it gives us some perspective on the geographic location of where Washington Square Park was in relation to the colony proper at the tip of Manhattan. So if you see the blue star, that is the edge of the city, and it is at what Chamber Street is today. The orange star is where Washington Square Park is today, and the purple star is basically at Wall Street today, so where the city was proper. From the 1640s when these folks, Trumpeter and Portuguese, were receiving their land grants, among many others. So you can see that the area where they were getting the land grants is so much farther away from the city proper. And when you think about what's going on, this is such a small colony surrounded by a lot of danger. If you look to the right of the blue star and the orange star, there's a road leading up north. And that is what, that's called Bowery Road today, Bowery. And it was a Native American trail. And so there's going to be a lot of traffic by the Native population across this way. It seems a bit of a buffer area up north to have some farmland there. And then finally, another reason why I think these folks might have been granted this kind of different type of status is the 1640s saw a lot of change in the governing structure of the colony. So in the early 1640s in particular, the Netherlands started to get more involved, and they really kind of took power away from the West India Company. For instance, they no longer granted the company an exclusive lease on fur trading. And so a lot of new settlers also came in at the time. And so New Amsterdam really changed from a company town to a real colony. And frankly, the slaves of the company might have been good allies to Kieft and these succeeding directors at this time of a lot of change. Again, these are conjectures. We don't know, but I'd like you to ruminate on what life was like for Trumpeter and Portuguese, where their loyalties lie. Was it with some of the the settlers? Was it with their own people? In a sense, was it with the company who gave them this new status? There's a lot of things to think about when we think about what their life could have been like and why they had this kind of different kind of status. Just as a final note, thanks to the documentation, we can pinpoint when the land changed hands. So Trumpeter's land in 1667, so this is after the English took over, passed to what is most likely his children, Bernard and Christina. And in 1694, Susanna Anthony Roberts, who is Portuguese's daughter, inherits the property. And so we see that there's continuity in who owns the land here that becomes Washington Square Park for some time, not quite 100 years, but we do know that the land did pass over to white English folks not too long after the turn of the century in the 1700s. But for a time, this does remain an important part of land for former slaves. Okay, so I'm gonna try and see if I can get Grace to be able to chat here. Let's see.
There we go. That should have worked.
Grace,
Hi, everyone.
Do we have any questions coming in? All right, Grace, you had a question?
Yes, we have a question from Martha, who's asking who actually owned the slaves, whether it was the company or individual owners, and were the owners based in North America or were they back on the other side of the ocean?
Good question. So what I've seen, and again, some of these records, or most of these early records are in Dutch, so I am not looking at the documents themselves. I don't speak Old Dutch, but the writing that has been done, we know that the company, the Dutch West India Company, did own their own slaves. We also know that there were slave owners in the colony that had their own slaves. And we know that even some of those individuals actually freed their slaves as well. Although we know a little bit less about the, whether there were stipulations or different legal statuses that happened with those folks. Most of the records that I've seen show that the slave owners were actually colonists. So they were people that were there. Just except for obviously the company. The company, had had owners back in the Netherlands as well as directors in the colony itself. So hopefully that answers your question, Martha. And hi to Martha, one of our greeters. Hopefully some of this wasn't so new for her.
Looks like that's our only question.
Okay. All right. Wow. Does this mean we actually did it in a half an hour? I'm really proud of ourselves.
Look at us.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope that everyone is doing well and is safe. And we look forward to bringing you more of these as we're all kind of stuck inside and kind of, dealing with the emotional and toll that, and for some people physical, that this is taking. So thank you everyone for joining in, and can't wait to see you all at Washington Square Park back when we're allowed back into normal life again. Thanks all.